I've been watching elections for almost 40 years, and you always hear whichever side lost claim that their people didn't show up at the polls and the other side did show up at the polls. And that's almost never true. The main reason that campaigns, that parties win or lose elections is really that independents in Michigan switch from one side to the other. That's what normally happens. And 2010 was an exception. It's really the first election I've seen where a couple 100,000 Democrats really didn't show up at the polls. People who were likely to vote and didn't vote. And that really happened because they were discouraged, or I think more likely because they were all wound up, they were all excited by Obama in 2008, and now that the Democrats control Congress, and they control the state house, and they control the presidency, and they control the Senate, well, there's just a feeling that politics wasn't so important. There wasn't a big threat. And on the other side, the Republicans were freaking out. Republicans had a very good turnout. Democrats had a very poor turnout. When I say that, what I'm really trying to say is that if you look at matched groups of people on the Michigan voter file, and you look at people who have identical voter records, but that one group is Democrats, one group is Republicans, but they voted in the same elections over time, they're the same age, they live in roughly the same communities. So, in other words, if we're talking about a 45-year-old living in West Bloomfield who has voted in a couple primaries and missed one general election in the last 10 years, let me just make up that group. And maybe there are a few hundred Democrats who fall in exactly that category and a few hundred Republicans. The Republicans in that group had 10 percentage point higher turnout. That's really what happened. And so the Republicans turned out 200,000 or so more of their base than the Democrats did, even controlling for the fact that Republicans and Democrats aren't demographically equivalent. So anyway, the Democrats, partly because they were demoralized and partly because I think the Democratic Party did a very poor job of running a turnout operation, Democrats really did stay home, a couple 100,000. Now, of course, Snyder won by more than 200,000, so it was not a question that 200,000 votes was the election, but a big part of the election was that people stayed home. 200,000 votes would have salvaged some seats in the Senate and some seats in the Michigan House, but would not have salvaged even one congressional seat. It wouldn't have changed the fundamental election, but still we saw it was a major factor in the results we saw. I don't think it was mainly that Verge was a bad candidate, although he probably wasn't ideal. I think that what really happened was that we got ourselves caught in a little, like a little drama, and the average voter found that the primary, Verge dedicated to claiming that he was farther left, let's say out of the mainstream, compared to Dillon. And Snyder spent his primary claiming that he was a centrist and not a right-winger. And the right-wingers were accusing him of being a centrist. So Democrats, in fairly large numbers, swung over in the Republican primary to vote for Snyder. And even the people who didn't vote in the primary picked this atmospheric up, and they heard over and over again, in effect, that Virgil is on the fringe of the Democratic Party, on the left, and that Snyder is not on the fringe, he's in the center of the Republican Party. So large numbers of people went and voted for him. The total number of votes that were cast in the Republican primary was huge compared to the Democratic primary. So the dust clears, and we have the fringe Democrat versus the centrist Republican. And it was very easy for those middle-class people, now not the core Democratic vote, but the middle-class professionals who make up an increasing share of the Democratic base, to vote for the Republican. And in fact, Snyder did very well in places like West Bloomfield, the city of Ann Arbor, East Grand Rapids, East Lansing, Grand Traverse, places with a substantial professional middle-class Democratic base. And not all of them, but many of them simply abandoned the Democratic Party, at least at the gubernatorial level, for the election. So you put that all together along with the failure of the Democratic base to turn out very well, and you end up with a 700,000 vote Republican win. No, I think that Dillon would have cut into the loss by 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points.
Is there any Democrat out there that could have made this a closer race in Michigan?
Well, if we had had somebody who had a built-in name and credibility as a candidate, I suppose. I mean, you could put together a fantasy candidate: Dennis Archer, Debbie Stabenow, Jim Blanchard, I suppose. But of the candidates who were available, no, I don't think that any of them would have won or even come substantially closer. And I'm not sure that even Dennis Archer would ever have had a real shot, but he would have made it a real race. There are two different ways to talk about voter reaction to events. You can talk about whether voters agree or disagree with political figures. And those are sort of like little sloshings in the ocean. You know, the water sloshes this way, the tides roll around, the water moves in and out. And those don't really make much difference. And right now, the Republicans are sort of squandering their advantage. In 2010, they had a big advantage. Now they've taken power. And the American people generally move away from whichever party is in power. And that's the reason that the two parties alternate, one after the other, because whoever is in power eventually undermines their position, they lose it. Well, we can talk about, you know, these shifts in opinion, but those are small and they're rather slow. But there's another phenomenon going on here which is different and has to be thought of differently. And that is that you can put people in a position where they feel so threatened by events that they become radicalized. And that is a phenomenon which is generally permanent for a person's life. If you radicalize people and you convince them that politics is a crucial part of what they're going to do in their lives, you are a political party that radicalizes the other side is causing itself grief for many years to come. And this year, the Republicans in Michigan, certainly in Wisconsin, but all over the United States, to varying degrees, have been radicalizing Democratic electorates, have been making people think that their whole way of life is at stake and that they need to devote their lives to politics. 40 years after the Vietnam War, if you get together a bunch of Democratic activists who are my age, and we talk about it, we discover that we got into the political world because of George McGovern and the Vietnam War and Richard Nixon. And we all had sort of the same reaction, and 40 years later we're all still in politics. 40 years from now, there will be people in Wisconsin who are talking about Scott Walker. And they, you know, devoted their lives to it. They first ran for office. They collected their first signatures on petitions. They donated to a campaign the first time. They became Democrats. And 40 years from now, they will still be Democrats. They will still be angry. Scott Walker will be long in his grave, and those people will still be out there causing problems for Republicans.